Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the return of our occasional series with the historian Robert Saunders, in which we explore significant political anniversaries. And this week is the 100th anniversary of Britain's one and only general strike. It happened in May 1926. It's a totemic event in British history, much mythologized, much misunderstood. We are going to be exploring what the dispute was really about and what was really at stake. Robert, I'd like to start with the idea of the general strike, and it is interesting that it was at the time often the general strike, not a general strike, capital G, capital S. It was a totemic idea, it was a singular idea. And in early 20th century political thought, it was associated not just with Marxism, but with that strand of Marxist thought called syndicalism. So I associate it, for instance, with the French political theorist Georges Sorel, an eccentric syndicalist Marxist, for whom the idea of the general strike, or as he called it, the myth of the general strike, was the revolutionary concept. And he was a fairly blood-curdling political theorist. He wrote Reflections on Violence. And the idea of the general strike for someone like him is that it was class war instantiated. All the workers come out together and you force the issue. None of this revisionism, evolutionary Marxism. You force labour and capital to the barricades, essentially. Now, we're going to be talking about general strike, which I think is not that. So my first question, in a way, is there any of that, do you think, in British politics in this period, that European Marxist, blood-curdling syndicalist idea? Or should we put that to one side? Is the British general strike a very different thing from that continental version?
I think the first thing to say is probably that almost regardless of the theory, it is very difficult not to see this as a revolutionary moment in the mid-1920s, because this is simply a period that crackles with revolutionary energy. We are 9 years away from the Russian Revolution. We are less than 4 years away from Mussolini marching on Rome. There is now a fascist state in Italy. There is now a workers' state in Russia, which is dedicated to exporting revolution across the world. It's only 2 years since the first ever Labour government in Britain, which feels like an earthquake. You've had people like one of the union leaders we'll talk about today, Jimmy Thomas, a man who starts work at the age of 12, sitting in cabinets as Secretary of State for the Colonies. We're only a few years on from the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. So all of these things are as present in the minds of people in the 1920s as Brexit or COVID would be to us. So almost whatever people are writing about the general strike, this is a time when the spectre of revolution is haunting the political imagination. In terms of the traditions that strikers are actually drawing upon, there is a kind of pre-Marxist English tradition of the general strike, which I think is really important, and which is also actually quite revolutionary. So the idea is often traced back to a man called William Benbow in 1832, and he publishes a pamphlet called The Grand National Holiday. And that always sounds like a lovely, jolly idea, until you remember that what he means by holiday is holy day. This is a kind of consecrated rebellion. He's talking about the Sabbath, when people rest from their labours and dedicate themselves to the Lord. Or there's a lot in there about the Old Testament idea of the Jubilee, when debts are forgiven and slaves are released from bondage. And the plan that he sets out is not simply that workers will withdraw their labour, but they will also take control of local charities and local endowments. They will forcibly redistribute local property, and crucially, they will elect a great national convention, which will displace the corrupt Parliament at Westminster and create genuine rule of the people. So there's always a sense here of the general strike as something that is about overthrowing a corrupt political regime. Now, that idea remains powerful across the 19th and early 20th century, but obviously it becomes more complicated as the state itself starts to democratise. Benbow is talking about a parliament that's elected by about 10% of the public. By 1926, you're looking at a Conservative government that has won nearly 8 million votes at a general election. So because of that, I think thinking on the general strike bifurcates into two traditions, one of which, as you say, is the syndicalist tradition, which argues that Parliament is kind of where democracy goes to die. Real democracy is about workers governing themselves in the workplace through their trade unions. It's not about one vote every few years, while the press barons and the millionaires and the party bosses carry on running the establishment. The other tradition actually is one that recasts the general strike as something that isn't principally political, but is industrial. So its ideology isn't revolution, it is solidarity. It's the idea that the union movement cannot walk by on the other side when the miners are being driven into penury, that when the question is asked, am I my brother's keeper, the union movement must reply, I am. And insofar as that involves putting pressure on government, which of course it does so because government is a protagonist in the industrial system. Government is, in fact, part of the industrial conflict around the future of an industry like coal mining. So the unions are using the weapons open to them, just as the coal miners are using the forms of pressure open to them. But the purpose of this is not to displace a government. It's not to change the way in which you are ruled. It is simply to achieve what trade unions are meant to achieve, which is an improvement in wages and conditions.
Was there a sense for some people in the TUC that actually it was going to be important to separate out those two traditions? So you have the one which shades into syndicalism and indeed revolutionary syndicalism, and there were some leading trade unionists, including among the miners, who had their roots in syndicalism. But on the other hand, the thing that you described as the industrial version of this, there were some union leaders who were nervous of calling this a general strike. They wanted to call it a national strike. So you said Benbow, it was the national holiday, holy day. A national strike in order to signal this is not the revolutionary version. This is solidarity. This is a great struggle in which the nation is involved. You can't just separate it out into different industries or into miners and mine owners. It's going to involve the government. It's going to involve the entire labour movement. But the fear was, if this is labelled a general strike, and we're going to talk about the ways in which so much of the fight was a fight about how to frame what was happening, if this is called a general strike, it makes it a bit easy for the government themselves to describe it as an incendiary act which threatens the British Constitution, the British way of life. So there was within, I think, the trade union movement, a nervousness about eliding what some of them wanted to call the national strike, a solidarity movement, into the general strike.
Yes, there absolutely are people in 1926 who are still influenced by those syndicalist ideas. A.J. Cook, for example, the General Secretary of the Miners' Federation, begins as a syndicalist. Even people who are not syndicalists have not forgotten that the first Labour government in 1924 is brought down in part by a fraudulent story published by the Daily Mail involving a forged document, the Zinoviev letter, in which the Conservative Party and the intelligence services may have been complicit. So there is still a sense that there is a kind of democratic rebalancing that is required through the work of trade unions. But if we look at the material that's being put out by the TUC during the general strike, it is constantly in a kind of defensive crouch position. So almost every issue of the British Worker, which is the TUC's newspaper during the strike, has either on the front page or just inside a big box in bold, which says, "The General Council does not challenge the Constitution. It is not desirous of undermining our parliamentary institutions. The sole aim of the Council is to secure for the miners a decent standard of life." And the fact that they're having to make that argument every day, in almost every piece of literature that they produce, shows that they're aware of the danger of this framing, and to some extent they're being forced to work inside it.
And that also highlights the other tension in this story, and this is part of the origin story that we need to tell, how the strike came about. The TUC was saying day after day during the strike, this is about supporting the miners. At the heart of this general dispute was a particular dispute. And the particular dispute long predated 1926, and indeed it was going to last much longer than the general strike itself, which was only 9 days. So we probably need to tell that story to get us back to 1926. This was, at its heart, a dispute between mine workers and mine owners. Ironically, therefore, both the main political parties could claim, not particularly convincingly, but they could claim it wasn't essentially their struggle, in the sense this is private mine owners. The coal mining industry was not going to be nationalised for another 20 years, and mine workers, of whom there were more than 1 million at this point in Britain. But it did concern the central industry in British life. It was the primary source of energy, it was the main employer, and it was the fuel on which the whole national economy depended. So a coal strike was always going to have national dimensions. Just say a bit about the years-long struggle that led up to the immediate conflict of May 1926.
So, what we're talking about here is a foundational industry that is in the middle of an economic crisis and also, in fact, a human crisis. Everything in the 19th century is built on coal in Britain. This is what drives the Industrial Revolution. It's what drives the rise of the British Empire across the world. As you've said, there are more than 1 million people working in the mining industry in the 1920s. And it is still essentially impossible at this time to imagine a modern industrial economy that is not built upon coal. The problem is that that industry is in an increasingly desperate state. It is hemorrhaging money. It is very poorly managed. It's fragmented into a large number of small and often quite inefficient companies. And it's losing out to cheap imported foreign coal, particularly from France and Germany. And that is, of course, made worse by one of Winston Churchill's worst decisions in the 1920s, which is his decision in 1925 to put the pound back on the gold standard. And essentially what that means is that the pound is now seriously overvalued. And so imported foreign coal becomes much cheaper and exported British coal becomes more expensive. So it's an industry that is in economic crisis. So the mine owners argue that we have to be businesslike about this. We've got to restore the industry to profitability. And the only way to do that is to cut wages and increase the working day. The mine workers respond with the slogan, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." They point out that coal miners are already exceptionally low paid, and their pay has dropped significantly since the First World War. They also point out that while the working day might in theory be 7 hours long, that is 7 hours that you spend at the seam. It doesn't include what might be an hour's walk underground at the start and the end of the day to get to and from the seam, in which you might be crawling for some of it. They also point out that this is an exceptionally dangerous industry. It averages something like 3 deaths every day over the 5 years previously. And those deaths are concentrated in the last hour of the working day because people are exhausted. So the argument becomes actually in some ways one about capitalist logic. The mine workers argue, if we have here a foundational industry that is essential to national prosperity, and we're saying that we can't operate this under current conditions without driving the workers into poverty and dangerous working conditions, then we have to run this in some other way. We have to find another way of doing this. And that's what brings the government into the strike, whether as a potential owner of the mining industry or simply as the agency that can help to reorganise the industry, to consolidate pits, to invest in new machinery and to bring it back to profitability without simply crushing the workers.
In the late summer of 1925, as these pressures started to build in the aftermath of Britain rejoining the gold standard, which, among other things, pushes interest rates up as well. So it just becomes much, much more expensive to run these mines, which are themselves indebted. And as you say, the mine owners are a fairly dispersed group. This is not a particularly well-organised industry. It's better organised on the labour side than on the owners' side, though the owners do know what their interest is. The government did intervene, Baldwin's government did intervene in the late summer of 1925 with a subsidy to maintain wages and therefore working hours in order to allow some kind of resolution. A royal commission was convened. The great and the good would try and work out how to resolve this. It is always worth remembering, I think, when we're talking about coal disputes and coal strikes, there's a big difference between the threat of this in the autumn and the threat of this in the spring. And the government was very worried. Baldwin's government was very worried about a long-running coal dispute through the winter of 1925-26. But there's also a thought that the government was buying itself time. So one of the questions about the general strike is whether Baldwin's government, in the end, welcomed the opportunity to force the issue here, force the issue of union power, force the issue of the coal industry, but it wanted to do it at a time of its choosing. And May 1926 found the government better prepared for a major industrial showdown than autumn 1925. Is it fair to say that what the government was doing with that 9-month subsidy was buying time for itself? It knew it was going to be deeply implicated in this one way or another, and it knew in the end probably this would come to a fight. It was preparing for the fight that it knew was going to come.
I don't think that the government explicitly wants or welcomes a strike. I think there is a recognition that if or when the strike comes, this is going to be a moment of supreme danger. It can't be certain that it will win. And it has seen how strikes bring down governments and bring down regimes in other parts of Europe. But if it is going to come, as you say, it wants it to be on its terms, and it wants it to be when it's ready. So right from the start of that period in 1925, when the government issues this 9-month subsidy, the whole machinery of government is organising to prepare for the strike. And we should remember that this is a state that has recently run a total war. So actually it has a lot of knowledge and experience about how you move supplies around the country, how you organise industry, how you make it resilient, how you manage a great national project of this kind. It's led by the Home Secretary, a man called William Joynson Hicks, or Jicks as he's known, who's sometimes nicknamed by his colleagues Mussolini Minor, because he's seen as someone who really does see reds under every bed and regards part of the project of conservatism as being to defeat socialism. So there's an extraordinary level of detailed preparation that goes across over that period. How do you maintain milk supplies? How do you move food around the country? How do you keep the docks open? How do you maintain power supplies? How can you use the resources that the government already has in terms of the armed forces, the police, the civil service, but also how do you augment that with volunteer labour? So when the fight comes, and it's not clear right up until the final hours at the end of April and the start of May 1926 that the strike is going to come now. But when it happens, the government is ready for it in a way that the union movement really is not.
It also includes preparations more broadly in the space of what you might call law and order, that there was in place a new system of special constables. Essentially, a kind of para-state was going to be drafted in order to keep the peace in this strike. I mean, the army were also going to be on standby. Armed warships were moored in ports, as the dockers were preparing to go out on strike. So this isn't just a question of preparing for moving food, keeping the power grid operative. There was also a sense that this is preparing, in those two traditions that you talked about at the beginning, for the possibility that this becomes more like, let's call it the continental general strike, than the 19th century British idea of the general strike. They were prepared, not, I think, for civil war, quite, but they were, as you said at the very beginning, prepared for the fact that this was potentially a revolutionary moment.
Yes, a lot has been written about the enormous numbers of people who volunteer to keep services going during the strike. And it's often forgotten that actually the biggest cohort of volunteers are not kind of titled young ladies serving tea in canteens. They are in fact young men, often unemployed men, who volunteer as special constables. They are augmenting the physical power of the state. Now that too actually has a history. If we go back to what often seems like the most revolutionary moment of the 19th century, April the 10th, 1848, the moment when the continent of Europe is going up in flames. The Chartists are gathering to present their third great national petition. On that occasion, too, about 100,000 people volunteer to be special constables to police the capital. And this becomes part of a celebratory story about how the reason that Britain doesn't have revolutions is because its people are loyal. It's not about the coercive power of the state. It's about the willingness of ordinary men in Britain to stand up and defend their country. And in that respect, the special constables in 1926 also have a kind of dual importance. So on the one hand, they are simply an essential part of the management of the strike, helping to move supplies around, helping to break picket lines. But they're also part of the kind of moral messaging of the strike. Because the more people who volunteer, the more people who stand by their institutions, the more the government can say, this is an attack upon the community, which the community is repelling, and in which we are acting as the champions of the community.
It's almost like an inversion of Leninism. Lenin in State and Revolution said, after the revolution, the people will be the police. It's like Baldwin's government is saying, no, before the revolution, the people will be the police force. What about the Labour Party in this story? So we are talking about the Labour movement, and at the heart of that in this strike is the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, the organising body of the union movement. The Labour Party that had been in government just a couple of years earlier was now in opposition, still led by Ramsay MacDonald, the man who had briefly been Prime Minister. Where did they stand, and how nervous were they, with someone like MacDonald, about what this strike might portend?
Well, on the one hand, we've got a much more powerful and self-confident union movement than anything Britain had seen even 20 years earlier. There's been a big growth in trade union membership, particularly during the First World War. It falls away a little bit in the early 1920s, but you've still got around 4.5 million people in trade unions affiliated to the TUC in 1925. There's been a real push to amalgamate unions into much bigger unions that can coordinate action more efficiently. The Miners' Federation of Great Britain is an example of that. So is the National Union of Railwaymen or the Transport and General Workers Union. They've got very talented leaders. Somebody like Jimmy Thomas is widely regarded as the best orator in the House of Commons. These are people who have started work age 10, 11, 12. They've not had much formal education, but they have fought their way to success. So one of the reasons why the strike is watched around the world and why it gets such extensive coverage in the American press or the French or the German press is that this is widely seen as pitting the most powerful trade union movement in Europe against the most powerful and self-confident democratic government. But the leadership of the unions, I think, are in a bit of a cleft stick because they lead this powerful movement, but they're also deeply entangled in the parliamentary Labour Party. Jimmy Thomas is both the Secretary-General of the Railway Union and a former Labour cabinet minister. Somebody like Ramsay MacDonald is moving throughout the strike between Number 10, Eccleston Square, where the TUC is based, and the House of Commons. And the TUC has dedicated much of its energy to building up a parliamentary Labour Party. It has just been in government, so it's invested in the political process. And for that reason, too, it's deeply nervous of anything that appears to challenge the political system within which it has risen to success and power.
Was the Labour Party at this point still seen as essentially the political wing of the union movement, or had even its brief time in government started to open up a gap? If it's going to be a party of national government, it has to be more than just the political wing of the union movement. Even if there are 4 million members of trade unions, there are an awful lot more people, an awful lot more workers, including now in the 1920s. We haven't yet had the full enfranchisement of women, but we have had the partial enfranchisement of women, over 30 property-owning women. But still, we're on the path. We're only 2 years away from equal enfranchisement of men and women. The national electorate is much broader than the trade union movement. The Labour Party does have pretensions now to be a party of government. It's been in government. It wants to be in government again. Is it at this point itself slightly caught between those two aspects of its identity, that it is the party of the unions, and it needs to be more than that if it's going to return to power?
Well, in a way, the founding principle of the Labour Party is that there are things that you can achieve through political struggle that you cannot achieve through industrial struggle, and that trade unions alone are not sufficient to achieve the things in which the Labour Party believes. I think we should perhaps remember that the charge against the Labour Party in this period is less that it's the political wing of the trade union movement than that it's the political wing of the Soviet Union. The constant theme of Tory propaganda in this period is that the Labour Party is a kind of front organisation, perhaps led by well-meaning but gullible fools, for Moscow. And indeed, the whole story of that first Labour government is framed by Labour's relationship with Moscow. The most contentious thing that it does is to restore diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. It actually falls, and the election is called, over a court case around a communist journalist who is seen as having encouraged rebellion in the army. The election is then dominated by this fraudulent scare story about the Communist International trying to direct what the Labour government does. And the Labour Party knows that that scandal or that collection of scandals has hurt it in office. So again, it's in a kind of defensive crouch where it knows that the most dangerous role it can hold in the public imagination is as a kind of tool of Moscow. And so it has to bend over backwards in a way that the Tory party doesn't to prove its respectability, to prove its loyalty and its fidelity to the Constitution. And Labour leaders in 1926 often point out that there are people sitting in the Conservative cabinet who were quite happy to advocate revolution and civil war and anti-parliamentary action when they were opposing Irish Home Rule in the years before 1914. But somehow, because they've got names like Lord Birkenhead and they belong to the Conservative Party, their loyalty to the Constitution is not in question, whereas the Labour movement is constantly having to persuade people that it belongs inside the system.
And yeah, I think I'm right in saying, you correct me if I'm wrong, that the strike itself, the government propaganda was not really directed to try to portray it as a Soviet plot. In a way, that would have been a step too far. This was too much, obviously, of a mass movement. This was too clearly a political event that had its origins in a British industrial dispute to plausibly be portrayed as actually a front for the Bolsheviks.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think it would be dangerous for the Conservative Party to suggest that 3 million people coming out on strike in 1926 is an index of the level of support for communism and the Soviet Union in Britain. But there is a lot of talk about a well-meaning, solidaristic labour movement that is being led in very dangerous places by extreme and dangerous men. I think one of the most remarkable statistics of the strike is that the government locks up 1/5 of the entire membership of the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1926. So there is a sense that this is a moment that might be exploited by extreme men, and in particular might be exploited by communists.
You said that until the last hour, it was uncertain whether the strike would go ahead. What finally decided it on the TUC side?
So it's partly simply that the clock is ticking down towards the end of the subsidy. But the actual trigger for it is inevitably an incident involving the Daily Mail. And this again feeds memories of the Zinoviev letter in 1924. So the Daily Mail tries to publish an editorial in which it condemns talk of a general strike as a revolutionary moment. And print workers at the Daily Mail ask for that to be changed. And they're told either to print it or to get out. And so they get out. And they go out on strike and they disrupt the publication of that issue of the Daily Mail. Now, that is, in a sense, a wildcat action. The TUC leadership has no idea that this has happened. It certainly hasn't directed it. But it provides, in a way, the ideal moment for the government and the mine owners to precipitate the battle, because they can now say the trade union movement is interfering with a fundamental liberty, the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech. We're not fighting the strike to defend the mine owners. It's really important that this is not seen as the government defending the mine owners. We're fighting it to defend the liberties of the British people and the rights of the freeborn Englishman.
And that precipitating action highlights two things about the general strike. One, which we haven't said about the mining dispute, is this isn't simply a question of will the miners withdraw their labour or not? In fact, what the mine owners had instituted was a lockout. The mine owners had said, you either come back to work on our terms, less pay, longer hours, or you will not work at all. This was an era in which industrial disputes involved the possible ending of labour on both sides of the dispute. Knowing that for the miners to be locked out was to impose enormous hardship. They would not be paid at all. Likewise, in the case of the Daily Mail, as you just said, the threat to the printers was you either do this or you get out, an effective lockout, which then precipitated a strike. And the other knock-on effect of that is that at the start of the strike, so it was general in the sense that the trade union movement called for people to stop work, union members to stop work, but not all industry, not all forms of work ceased. But one crucially that did was printing. The print workers did come out, which meant that at the start of the strike, from the beginning, there were no newspapers. And so in some ways, the scarcest commodity of all during the strike was information. And it was the battle for information that was absolutely key to how the strike would play out. So you mentioned that the trade unions produced their own newspaper, so did the government. Just say a little bit about what happened to news, given that the newspapers stopped printing.
Yeah, so some newspapers do continue printing in a very sort of attenuated form. Some local newspapers that are not unionised are still publishing. The Daily Mail actually has a publishing arm in Paris, and so it continues to print in Paris and fly copies over. But obviously, distribution is a fraction of what it would normally be. So what we get instead are these two rival newspapers. The government creates something called the British Gazette, and the TUC responds with the British Worker. The British Gazette is actually run by Winston Churchill. It's one of Stanley Baldwin's most brilliant moves during the strike, is to get Winston Churchill out of the centre of decision-making and give him a newspaper to run.
And it should be said, Churchill, former journalist. This is his métier.
Yes, absolutely. It's the kind of task that he loves, and he does it with enormous panache. If you didn't know that Winston Churchill had edited and written much of this newspaper, you would get about a paragraph into it, and you would know that Winston Churchill had written this newspaper. It's written in the most extraordinary Churchillian style. It really does present the strike as a cosmic struggle for the survival of civilization itself. He has a sub-editor who spends a great deal of time trying to pencil out the more egregious untruths that Churchill has inserted in there, but it is essentially a highly propagandistic publication. But it has the machinery of government behind it. The Royal Air Force helps to distribute it. It's dropping copies over towns and cities. And it's selling around 7-8 million copies by the end of the strike. The British Worker, which is based on the Daily Herald, the Labour Party's newspaper, is a more sober production. It's frankly a more honest production. It's trying to prove its respectability, so it's careful not to be quite as propagandistic as the British Gazette. But it encounters all kinds of practical problems. It takes a while to persuade the printers' unions that they should still print it, even though they're technically on strike at the time. It's quite difficult to distribute newspapers because they're bulky. It's quite easy for government to stop this. And it is, I think, strikingly defensive again in its tone. So much of the newspaper is about reiterating this is an industrial struggle, it's not a constitutional struggle. A lot of it is about saying, please don't fight the police, there must be no violence. It encourages workers to wear their medals while they're out on strike, the medals that they've won in the First World War, as a reminder that you are people of dignity. These are people who have served their country. They're not revolutionaries. They are the people on which democracy is actually based. And it's interesting that both newspapers actually publish poetry, and it's quite telling what they choose to print. So Churchill chooses for the British Gazette almost every day a little bit of doggerel from Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling is one of those writers who is capable of being both transcendently brilliant and absolutely dreadful. But what Churchill loves about these quotes, they're all about saving England from its enemies, protecting England from attack. Whereas the poetry in the British Worker is written by somebody who uses the synonym Tom Fool. Eleanor Farjeon, I think her name is, most famous for writing the hymn Morning Has Broken. But those hymns are all actually about the desire of the worker for a higher life, not for revolutionary change, but for a life of meaning and humanity and dignity. And I think that, again, captures something of the difference between the two papers.
And as you say, the British Worker wanted to emphasise that this was not a struggle for and against the Constitution. Presumably, therefore, the Churchillian position was to try and emphasise this absolutely was a fight for the Constitution. And Baldwin himself emphasised during the strike, though he had some sympathy with the workers, Baldwin is a more, in some ways, conciliatory figure than either his Home Secretary or his Chancellor of the Exchequer. His duty as Prime Minister was to defend the Constitution. And underlying that was a struggle as to whether or not the strike was legal. And in fact, I think as the strike went on, the government's key strategy was to try and frame the strike as illegal. And the question of the legality or illegality of industrial action was really central to British politics in the first part of the 20th century. Some of the great legal disputes of the age did concern the legal rights of trade unions, their liability for industrial action, the liability of the leaders of trade unions, and indeed their funds for the costs of industrial action. Was the strike legal? I mean, I'm going to ask you that blunt question. By the end of the strike, the government thought it had a legal opinion that stated that it was illegal. But I think there were lots of questions as to whether that legal opinion had not itself been contrived for political purposes. Was the strike legal?
Well, it's a question that's never decided by the courts. The government draws heavily on some obiter dicta, some accompanying remarks made by a judge, which suggests that the strike is illegal. But the fact that the government is actually preparing to legislate in the final stages of the strike to make the strike illegal suggests that actually the government's own lawyers do not believe this. They think that actually under the Trade Disputes Act, the case for the strike probably is robust. But as you say, it really does matter. A Liberal grandee called Sir John Simon, who's also a legal authority, gives a great speech in the House of Commons around midnight, about halfway through the strike, in which he argues that the strike is unlawful and that not just the trade union leadership, but every individual striker is in breach of contract and is in legal jeopardy for as long as they participate in the strike. That speech is then broadcast on the BBC. The two main leaders of the miners' union, A.J. Cook and Herbert Smith, are in the House of Commons to listen to Sir John Simon speak, and they stay for the whole thing. And the British Worker publishes very detailed rebuttals of his claims. And I think the fact that this question matters so much does tell us something really important about the character of the TUC at this time. You could take the view, well, to hell whether it's legal or not. We have a kind of higher law. This is actually an argument that's made by some of the left during the 1984-85 miners' strike. Ken Livingstone and Jeremy Corbyn sign a letter in which they say the only legal authority on matters of industrial conflict is the Trade Union Congress. They don't argue that in 1926. The absolute founding assumption is that if it is illegal, we wouldn't do it. So we have to establish again our constitutionality and our law-abiding character.
You mentioned the BBC there. In that dearth of information where essentially, though one was more overtly propagandistic than the other, you have the two sides putting out their version of the news in their own newspapers. This is very, very early in the history of radio, and it's very, very early in the history of the BBC. In 1926, the BBC had been in existence for, I think, 4 years. It was still a private company. It still had shareholders. Its chairman, Lord Gainsford, I think he was called, was a mine owner. So it was the chairman of the BBC was a mine owner, so he may not have been entirely impartial. Its managing director, not yet called Director General, was John Reith, the man who would essentially create the modern BBC. But radio was still a minority pursuit in the sense that I think there were just over 1 million radio licenses in existence at this time. And yet it was clearly understood that getting your point of view onto the airwaves, including in an era where there weren't that many radio licenses and that many radios, but there are photos from the strike of giant gramophone-style microphones projecting to large crowds BBC radio broadcasts outside factory gates and so on. So there was also a collective aspect to radio listening in this period. The struggle to get your voice on the airwaves was a key part of the strike. And I think it's fair to say that the government won that battle in the sense that what people heard on the BBC was not quite, but almost exclusively the government's position, including the voice of Stanley Baldwin.
Yes, I think what we get from the BBC, and this is, of course, its first great news crisis, is a striking degree of voluntary compliance. It is, as you say, a private company. It's trying to get a charter. It is deeply concerned that the government might, in fact, take it over during the strike. And so, in a bid to maintain its formal independence, to some extent it does sacrifice its editorial independence. So, Stanley Baldwin broadcasts. Various Liberals who support the government's position, including Asquith and Earl Grey, broadcast. Ramsay MacDonald does not. The trade union leadership are not invited on to broadcast. And there's a particularly telling moment when the Archbishop of Canterbury organises a kind of meeting of the main religious leaders of the country, the Catholic archbishops, the leaders of the nonconformist churches, and they come up with a joint statement which encourages a return to negotiations and actually suggests a plan for how to do it. And he intends to broadcast this on the BBC. And at the wish of Stanley Baldwin, the invitation is withdrawn, and the Archbishop finds that he can no longer access what is becoming the principal form of political communication at the time. It's published in the British Worker, but it's not broadcast on the BBC.
And Reith was continually told throughout the strike, effectively, if you don't do what we want, we will let Churchill loose on you. And then you'll be in a just look at the British Gazette. If you want to not become the radio version of that, you're going to have to mind your step very, very carefully. And it's a pretty effective hardball piece of politics. And I think the BBC was not equipped for politics of that kind.
I think that's true, but I think it's probably also fair to say that the response to the BBC is not simply out of the fear of direct editorial intervention. This is a corporation that imagines itself as a national entity. It is, in a sense, the voice piece of Britain. And it's a mark in a way of the success of the government's message that what we have here is a sectarian attack upon the life of the nation. And insofar as the BBC speaks for the nation, therefore it's not really neutral on this question.
I want to ask you now about the strike itself as a social phenomenon as well as a political phenomenon. How general was it? It begins because of an agreement between the big three unions, the miners, the railwaymen, and the Transport and General Workers Union, that were one to go out, the others will go out in solidarity. So the big three are the heart of this strike, and a strike of the big three is probably enough to get the label general strike. But beyond that, we've talked about the print workers. How general was it? Was it an absolute bringing of the country to a halt?
It isn't, because actually the TUC doesn't want that. So the TUC identifies two lines of battle, and so much of the rhetoric of this is drawn from the memory of the First World War. So there is a kind of first line that goes out on the 3rd, 4th of May, and then there is a second line that will be called out if necessary. So what we get for most of the strike is around 3 million people, around a fifth of the working age population. We're talking about almost all forms of transport. We're talking about most heavy industry, printing, coal mining, and the response is extraordinarily disciplined. I think an underrated part of the story here actually is the discipline with which workers respond to the instructions of the TUC. Almost all of the workers who are called out do come out. And that is a remarkable display of solidarity. Most of these people are not coal miners, but what they're doing is they are putting at risk their jobs, their livelihood, the security of their families in order to stand by the coal miners. Many of them know that if the strike fails, they are likely to be punished. They might lose their jobs. In the best case scenario, they're probably going to experience cuts in their pay and working conditions, but they do it anyway. So Jonathan Schneer, in his book on the general strike, which is very good, makes a real theme of this, I think, that the central theme of the strike in many ways is generosity, both on the part of the strikers and on the part of the volunteers. People who are not coal miners, who are not coal owners, are nonetheless standing up to support whatever they regard as the correct side in the strike.
And you say there was a second wave. I mean, was the strategy essentially, we'll start this thing, and if they don't back down, we're going to ratchet up the pressure by pulling more and more people out of work?
Yes, because the goal of the TUC isn't to bring the economy to a halt, and it isn't to bring down the government. The goal of the TUC is to restore negotiations.
Particularly restore negotiations in the mining industry.
Exactly, yes. It's to get the withdrawal of the lockout notices, and you're absolutely right to say that the mining dispute begins as a lockout, not as a withdrawal of labour by the miners. And it wants the government and the mine owners to come back to the negotiating table without the threat of lockouts and wage cuts hanging over them. So you want a sense that you can ratchet up the pressure if the initial demand for negotiations is not satisfied. But there's also a couple of other considerations here. One is that striking on this scale is exceptionally expensive. You are going to be providing strike pay to colossal numbers of people. And even the biggest unions recognise they can only actually do this for perhaps a maximum of 2 weeks. There is a clock ticking here. There are some unions that you can't call out too quickly because they simply can't sustain this for very long. And what you absolutely don't want is the strike weakening halfway through. The other point is that it is obviously not the desire of the TUC to starve the British workforce. One of the problems for the TUC is that if it wants to exert its full power, then the obvious way to do that is to stop the supply of electricity and power. It is to make it almost impossible to move food around the country. But that means that its own people go cold and hungry. So there is a limit actually to the level of economic damage that the TUC is willing to wield. Whereas the government can exert its full power in this strike, the TUC to some extent is always fighting with one hand behind its back.
And then on the other side, the volunteers who came out to fill the breach, to step in. We've talked about the special constables. Anyone who's read Evil in War, Brideshead Revisited, and others, there are references to the general strike, the boy Mulcasters of this world, for whom it was an opportunity because they hadn't had a chance to fight in the trenches, to get stuck in. And it's also a great jaunt. There's a sort of P.G. Wodehouse aspect to the way that Evil in War writes about it. You've got the special constables, you've got an almost cliched versions in which upper-class toffs see this as an opportunity to drive big, loud vehicles and wave sticks around. What about everybody else? To what extent is it possible to gauge for people who were not unionised, who did not work in industry, the extent to which they supported the strike? Or on the other hand, they were willing to come out, broadly speaking, let's not say on the side of the mine owners, because I don't think they would think of it as being on the side of the mine owners, but on the side of the government and the constitution.
I think one of the more regrettable features of how the strike is remembered is that it tends to focus very much on this idea of jolly japes by upper and middle class volunteers. And those people do exist, of course. There are quite large numbers of students coming up from Cambridge University in particular who think it's tremendously good fun to try and drive a bus or to try to drive a train.
And occasionally it should be said, crash said bus or train, killing people.
Absolutely. I mean, they're disastrously incompetent at this. There's also a sense in which actually it might be quite fun to be licensed to fight with working class toughs. There are some young people who are very up for that. But actually, much the biggest group of volunteers comes from the unemployed. These are generally actually working class people. And a lot of the volunteering work they're doing is very difficult and potentially dangerous. You might be unloading extremely heavy crates all day. You might be trying to maintain a power station. You've then got to get those supplies past a picket. If you're a special constable, the assumption of that is that you may well find yourself in a physical confrontation with striking workers. And volunteers could actually have quite mixed sympathies on this. There's a letter from the composer Ralph Vaughan Williams about this, in which he talks about how his sympathies are all with the miners. He doesn't want to be supporting the coal owners, who are widely regarded as a terrible group of people. But fundamentally, he regards this as an attack upon a democratic society, and therefore it is his reluctant duty as a citizen to step up and do that. And of course, there's an extent to which people are coming up with justifications that sound good to themselves. But I think by and large, the volunteering experience is not one of sort of popcorn in the park. There is something more serious about this. And that, again, is partly why the memory of the volunteers is important. And it's partly why we don't get a kind of anti-democratic backlash as a result of the strike. This doesn't actually disrupt the movement to full universal suffrage that we get in 1928. It's because there is a story that can be told about the general strike of ordinary people, and frequently working people, volunteering in a sober fashion to defend their institutions.
It's also part of the myth of the general strike, and like all myths, it may be based on some truth, that it was a remarkably non-violent event, relative to, as I said at the beginning, the blood-curdling version in some Marxist theory at least, and indeed some practice as well, that the point of the general strike is to bring the classes into direct conflict with each other. Do you think it is true that this was a very non-violent version of this kind of politics? And for many people, what that made it was quintessentially British. Only the British could have a general strike in which the workers and the capitalists did not end up trying to kill each other.
There's an awful lot of self-congratulation about this. There's a diary entry, I think, by the King, in which he says, "The British really are a marvellous people. Imagine the French trying to have a general strike of this kind." Now, inevitably, that isn't quite true. There are, for example, 4 days of violent disturbances in Hull. This culminates with soldiers fixing bayonets and facing off against workers. There are serious instances of violence involving hundreds or thousands of people in Middlesbrough, in Leeds, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow. The Flying Scotsman is deliberately derailed when workers rip up railway tracks, and miraculously there aren't more people killed. In London, there are delivery vans and cars being overturned in the streets by pickets and striking workers. And as you indicated earlier, I think we shouldn't underestimate the level of state violence here. The Emergency Powers Act does give the government extraordinary powers of arbitrary detention and arrest. It arrests about a fifth of the membership of the Communist Party. There are warships in most major docks. 20 tanks accompany food out of the London docks in a particular demonstration of strength at one point. But having said all of that, I think there is a danger here perhaps that we overcorrect. Precisely because we now have digital newspapers from the period, we can search them and we can find all of the instances of violence and we can stack them up on top of each other. But this is a generation that remembers the Russian Revolution, that remembers events in Italy, the Civil War in Ireland, that has experienced the First World War. It remembers the much greater violence, actually, of the years before 1914. They know what political violence looks like, and it isn't really this. The TUC is absolutely determined to showcase its respectability and constantly to discourage violence. There are lots of government spies that are sent out to kind of penetrate union lodges, and they simply can't find the evidence they're looking for of weapons being stockpiled or of kind of military councils being formed. It's just not happening. And that, I think, is really important to the memory of the strike and the ability to tell a story of the strike later as a vindication of democracy rather than an assault upon it.
In the second part of this conversation, we're going to talk about how and why the strike came to an end and its consequences, short, medium, and long term. This is an event that lives long in the memory, but also does change the direction of British politics in some respects. But I want to ask you one more question here, which is, do you think the general strike revealed essentially a divided nation or actually a surprisingly united nation, in the sense that, on the one hand, you could say, as general strikes are meant to do, it did marshal the forces on each side. Some people came out with the strikers, stopped working, and some people came in to fill that gap. As you said, many from the unemployed. They didn't join the strikers. They joined the government in trying to keep services going. They unloaded crates in the docks or whatever it was. The classes seemed to separate out. Support for the strike tended to be among the working classes, and support for the government was by far greater among the upper middle, and middle classes. And therefore, as one might expect, a strike of this kind revealed a nation divided by class, divided by work, what kind of work you did, whether you were in or out of work, divided by political sympathy. On the other hand, as you mentioned there, a lot of people were very conflicted in this strike, including members of the middle and upper classes. They had a lot of sympathy with the miners. The mine owners were disgusting people. You didn't have to be a member of a trade union to think, I don't want to die in their ditch, thank you very much. And actually what this strike revealed is, though for many people you had to pick a side, for a lot of people it was not easy to pick a side. And actually they would have preferred not to have to pick a side. And once the strike was over, they would rather think of it as an event in which there was some merit on both sides of the argument.
I think at its core, a general strike is about class conflict. And class is obviously both a form of solidarity and a dividing line. And the fact that millions of people who are not coal miners and who are not coal owners nonetheless stand up and take a side in this dispute does speak to the strength of class identities and class consciousness in this period. There is a powerful sense of who you stand with and who you stand against. That is obviously particularly marked in the mining industry. At the negotiating table there, you've got somebody like Herbert Smith, the president of the Miners' Federation, a man who is orphaned as a child, who comes out of the workhouse to go down the pit, who has pulled the bodies of his colleagues out of coal mines because he's done a lot of rescue work. You've got A.J. Cook, who again starts work at the age of 10, who watches as a man is killed next to him on his first day down the mine. And on the other side of the table, you've got Sir Adam Nimmo, Sir Evan Williams. You've got these knights of the realm, public school educated, the ancient universities. You've got some of the richest aristocrats in the country extracting money from the mining industry simply because they happen to own the land under which the coal has been found. But even beyond the mining industry, there is a powerful sense of working people fought the First World War and didn't get the rewards that they were promised, that the promises that were made were broken. The promises that were made to the mining industry in the Sankey Commission were broken. So there is that sense of knowing where you stand, knowing who us are and knowing who they are. But alongside that, as you suggest, I think there is something more complicated going on, which is partly why we don't get here the kind of battles between the fascists and the communists in the streets that you're seeing in some other parts of Europe. The Labour movement doesn't lose faith in the parliamentary method. It is constantly negotiating all the way through the strike to try to find an off-ramp. Both sides are actually appealing to the same principles of democracy, solidarity, patriotism, and constitutionalism. And there are all kinds of people, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, or various aristocrats, or Sir Herbert Samuel returning from his books in Italy to try to negotiate some kind of compromise. The Archbishop's appeal actually produces thousands of petitions from parish churches around the country in support of reopening negotiations. And in that sense, while there is division here, there are also all sorts of cross-hatchings across it that perhaps soothe and work across those dividing lines. And that, again, I think is what makes it possible to remember the strike as a triumph of solidarity that shows the strength and the resilience of British democracy, rather than as a rupture that endangers it.
We just wanted to let you know about another live event that we have coming up. This one is not a film. It is happening at the Cheltenham Science Festival on Wednesday the 3rd of June at 7 p.m. I am going to be in conversation for this podcast with Jimmy Wales, the man who created Wikipedia, which I think is the greatest democratic experiment of our time. And I'm going to be talking to him about what can be learned from Wikipedia for just about everything. If you'd like to come, you can get your tickets now. Go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. We'd love to see you there. Next time, it's part 2 of my conversation with Robert about the general strike, exploring how and why it ended the way it did, what its consequences were for British politics before and after the Second World War, but also exploring the miners' strikes of the 1970s and the 1980s, and the idea of a general strike in 2026. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.